Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John D, using the translation I did with Dr. Nancy Turner that came out a couple years ago from Ouroboros Press. Those of you who have been studying along with me all this time know that we are now in Theorem 23 of 24, and we're going to finish Theorem 23 today. So let's take a look at that particular theorem. What you get after the first part, which we looked at before, is basically 4 charts and several different transformations of the monad. Those of you who have been studying along with me all this time know the spiel I usually give here, right? That this is an advanced class. I'm assuming you know who John D is. I'm assuming you know what the Monas Hieroglyphica is. I'm assuming that you have read up to a certain point and so on. But as I've also told you, after Theorem 22, the initiatory content basically stops, or at least it is simply repeating itself. The drafting instructions you got last time could be followed by someone who didn't even know the rest of the monad. That's not quite true about these charts, but it is a good way to kind of review things and see if you've got the overall arc of what is going on. If you're just joining us here, though, I have 4 different playlists below. I would love to have you in the class. I've been amazed at how many people have joined us in these classes. So if you're interested, that's below. Just be aware if you keep watching here that there is an awful lot that has happened in the letters and in the theorems before you get now. In fact, we're almost to the end. What happened last time was we looked at D's drafting instructions. They were typical compass and straight edge drafting instructions, the kind you're supposed to use in ancient Greek geometry. But there wasn't any secret about it. There were lots of kind of snarky in jokes, and I'm sorry, I know there were some viewers who didn't like that much, and I apologize. I mean, I didn't particularly like it that much either, but there is no one I know in literature who likes to make in jokes more than John D. So if you, on the other hand, just want to draw a monad and you don't care about what it means, you can just flip to Theorem 23 and do that. Okay, so this is what he gave you in the 1564 Antwerp edition. Here's the 1591 Frankfurt edition that was still in D's life. The most important takeaway from that is looking at what his unit, remember unit in Greek is monas, same in Latin. So this is his measure of 1 right here. Now that's important with the whole conic section subtext and the parabolas, but as we talked about at the end of Theorem 22, if you're doing projections onto the tree of life, that really isn't even relevant. And we've also seen D draw his monad in different ways that don't exactly follow his measurements. Anyway, then he gives you this kind of pretty version you can use if you want, and that's where we left off with this theorem. He says that you can make it wider and do a variety of things to make it to ornament it, as long as it doesn't throw into disorder this new discipline of hieroglyphic commensuration. He talked about this new discipline, new field of study that he was creating in his opening letter to Maximilian, if you remember. And I think I ought to point out that commensuration, in the sense that he's using it here, is the study of symmetric and proportional measurements, something he has dealt with a lot, particularly talking about the importance of symmetry. All right, so in this next paragraph, he's setting up 4 things, and 4 charts are going to follow. So let's read this together. He says, moreover, we will show you a few more exercises out of 100 already, methods which may be obvious to those becoming practiced in the symmetries of our monad. First, we shall begin with the quaternary lines of our cross. Someone might say out of habit that there are simply 4 lines. Also, the same quaternary lines, in a different way, have allowed for a type of division and calculation. Thirdly, we will show some useful examples of the offices marked by God in nature to the numbers which, here or in other theorems of this little book, we have artfully elicited. We will also introduce, in appropriate places, some things which, when set rightly into motion, yield some not at all paltry delights, and we will discharge this most briefly. That last part, the bit of the things that yield some not at all paltry delights, becomes happily funny if you realize what he's talking about, as you will when you get to that last chart. Okay, let's take a look at his first chart just as it shows up. I'm going to give it to you in English very quickly here, but the fact that he gives the first chart and then talks about it afterwards, given the kind of flow of the monad, seems to me to really clearly imply that he is assuming that this graphic could be easily read by a Renaissance humanist in his era who is interested in, at least in the topics that are the four ways he's explaining these theorems, mathematically, magically, anagogically, kabbalistically. So I just want to show you this, and then I'm going to talk about the text actually before we talk about the chart in this case, because I don't think that the things that are obvious to a Renaissance humanist are necessarily obvious to us, even someone who is a humanist but has not read the Monad. All right, so let's look at this where he says our canon of metathesis. We've seen that word metathesis before when he gave that alchemical diagram, where it seemed like his alchemical workshop, and it seemed like there was a little spout coming off of the top, and he said by metathesis this could be the first letter of the Greek alphabet, alpha. So moving around of parts. I'll define that even more in the next slide. But how about canon? This is another word that is important to know in understanding it, because in Dee's time, not exactly in ours, but in Dee's time, this was a religious rule or a religious law made by some ecclesiastical authority. Today, it can just mean what educated people accept, like, this is the canon of fill in the blank literature, or this is canonical thought in chemistry. But then it's a specifically ecclesiastical meaning. The sacred canon was the Bible, but it's the Bible without the apocryphal texts. So this is either funny or sad or both, because remember, especially in theorems 21 and 22, he's talking about things that are outright heretical and are referring to non-apocryphal biblical works indirectly, although not overtly. But, having Jesus not die and rescuing Adam, who's made out of the four elements, like you get in Zosimus of Panopolis, that's heretical. The Book of Enoch, which Zosimus of Panopolis clearly knows and Dee is clearly interested in even before the Monad, and it's his wish to discover the language of the prophet Enoch is why in his conversations with angels, that language that come through to Dee and Kelly is often called Enochian, is because of the Book of Enoch. That's heretical. But in Theorem 23, as I talked about in the first part in the drafting instructions, you can read the whole thing with a doctrinal view of Christianity, and it's no secret to anyone living in that time period that doctrinal is a different thing if you are Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, or one of the different Protestant schisms, because you're in the midst of the bloody religious wars that are the Protestant Reformation in Europe, and they don't end with Dee. There's 100 years war after Dee. So that also explains why so much is hidden. All right, let's see what he says here. He says, let there be a continuous multiplication of the natural order out of the first monad of all numbers described, from the first to the last. Oh, remember, we've had the last becoming the first. So that the product of the first and second is multiplied by the third, and the product by the fourth, and similarly until the last. Then the last product determines all possible metatheses among the number of terms in that place. Likewise for any number and for a variety of things. Okay, he sets up this paragraph as a quote. He has out in his margin quote marks, just like he did at the end of Theorem 22 with that quote by Demosthenes, or a pseudo-Demosthenes, where we never could find that quote, but we could at least translate it. I can't find this quote either, but it's a commonplace idea among Neoplatonic Pythagoreans. Remember, Pythagorean thought is brought into Platonism, and now we have Neoplatonism, where it's merged with Christianity. So when he says, let there be a continuous multiplication of the natural order, in Latin, that sounds a lot like, well, let there be light, Genesis 1:3, the fiat lux that was so important in the early theorems. So if you think about what has gone on in those first theorems, he's setting this up here yet again as an idea of how Pythagorean thought is a way of recognizing order in the apparent chaos of the natural world. And you can see in the tumultuous time period and dangerous and bloody time period that he lived in, why the idea that numbers are transcendental and pondering them takes you outside of this mess of what's going on around you could be very, very appealing. And so that is something that you see often in Neoplatonism, along with the restoration of the good and other things we've talked about. In the next paragraph there, he says, I very much commend this operation to you, O king, that's Maximilian, of course, as one most useful in every investigation of nature and in other affairs of the Republic. I am accustomed to use it with the greatest pleasure in the Timura of the Hebrews. He talked about Timura, of course, in his opening letter to Maximilian. He also mentioned Gematria and Notaricon as being skills that were used by the Hebrews. If you wonder why Maximilian should care about any of this, I'll just remind you, we don't know for sure that Maximilian even read it. I would personally suspect he didn't understand it. Dee never says he does. Dee says he opened its secrets to Elizabeth I, the Queen of England. He later tries to explain it to Maximilian's descendant, Rudolph II. But if Maximilian did try to understand it, and parenthetically, I'll note that printer Sylvius, who printed this, was the royal typographer. One of the things he'd be most interested in is the uses of ciphering and the ways that you find sacred hidden meanings in Hebrew with Gematria, Notaricon, and Timura has 3 different forms that I've talked about before. All that imports directly into Latin, or for that matter, into English. We can do English Notaricons, Gematria. I've never heard of people doing Timura in English, but you could. A friend of mine who tragically died back in 2014, who went by the name of Glenn Claston and wrote fascinating posts on the Voynich manuscript research group, which I was a part of back then, loved to point out that these kind of things had great intelligence uses and demonstrate how you could use the monad as a cipher and so on. Down the road, I'm going to do a whole video on how you can use the monad for ciphering and what kinds of ciphers we have any reason to think Dee would know. But I would submit to you, that right there is a reason why Maximilian would be very interested in what's going on here. Anyway, as I mentioned, since this comes after the chart, the assumption is that what he says in the chart, which you now see an English translation of, would be readily understandable to a Renaissance humanist. It's not so much for us, so let me run through it real quick. When he says that it has 24 possible metatheses, let's go through that word again. It's the transposition of letters, syllables, or sounds in a word, usually. And usually for numbers, we would use permutation. They're just developing rules for mathematical permutation than using Arabic numerals because they've been using Roman numerals. But usually with numbers, you'd say permutation. But you've also seen how Dee is interested in transposing all kinds of things. He wants a rule that is going to govern letters, parts of letters, symbols, and numbers. So he's using metathesis here much more actually than in Theorem 22 in an unusual way, so that it can apply to any sort of transposed placement of a thing. When we say that this quaternary has 24 possible metatheses, that just means you can arrange the 4 numbers into 24 different sequences. When he says it has a Pythagorean sum of 10, that's just like the tetractys, right? You add up 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you get 10. That's the denary or the decad. We've also seen in his Kabbalistic level, the first application there is to the 10 sephirot. When it has a sum of all parts together of 30, that's what he's talking about. No, you don't need the parentheses. I just thought it might make it easier to see what he's talking about. And if you, with gematria, by the way, reduce 30, you get 3, so then you're back to his ternary. Okay, that one was simple. Next one is pretty simple too. This is his artificial quaternary. We'll just look at this in English. Remember that from 21 on, he's used artificial a lot, but by artificial, he means artfully created, not something that naturally occurs in nature. It's related to Plato's use of the Greek word techne, a skilled art or craft, for example. And you have been resurrecting the monad as part of the initiatory path in 21 and 22. How? By art. Okay, so he says the artificial ternary can be continuously multiplied. If you do that, it's going to yield 12. Now, you might think that this should be a 4, but look at the way he's doing it, right? 1 times 2 times 3 times 4. By simple addition, you're going to get 8. Now, why is he dividing 8 into 1 and 7? Look at the way that he writes 1 here. He's writing it as he very often does as a Roman numeral, and he has 7 as an Arabic numeral there. Well, 1 is the unit, the monad. It's perfect. 7 is a very magical number, and we can see all kinds of 7s, but they don't have to do with the world of being. Remember when we talked about that with Platonic forms? If you look at measurements like number of edges and that kind of thing, you don't get 7s. You get 3s, 4s, 6s, 8s, 12s. There's never a 7. You get 7 once that world of being has transferred through the receptacle into the world of becoming, and then you get it as measurements of days of the week, as the 7 classical planets that are restoring order onto the chaos of the world of becoming, and that kind of thing. Then he divides 7, of course, into his quaternary and ternary. You add all parts together and you get 24. And then he says, all possible metatheses of the quaternary are equal, and also designate best and most sound physical gold. There you might say, what? How did gold get in here? This is yet another, and we've seen many, many examples of this, where it's a place where somebody who is sure this is about physical alchemy and turning lead into gold would say, look, there, physical gold, 24 carats above ground by itself. But remember that this is, to borrow from Shannon Grimes again, becoming gold. It's a merger with the divine that is associated with gold. There's also a great pun in there because Dee can't resist making puns. It's one of the reasons it's both fun and occasionally frustrating to read him in Latin. But the pun here with summa can mean the sum of, or something that yields something else, but it can also mean the summit, the pinnacle. Think of summum bonum, for example. It's a superlative. It's the ultimate good. Okay. So then we have a little text after that. We'll go through this text here. He says, verily, I am not unaware that from the arithmetical virtue and set form, pun on mathematical sets there, of the quaternary, many other numbers could have been brought to light. But he who would not understand how to unfold and illuminate the great obscurity of their nature would feel that their great multitude was exhausting rather than sharpening his mind. That may sound patronizing, but think about it. I mean, if you're reading to this point, at least it was my experience reading to this point many times before I started to understand it, that what he's saying is true. Giving a bunch more charts that I didn't understand at this point would have just frustrated and depressed me. So on the other hand, once you do understand, you can make up those charts on your own, right? If you're a chart kind of person. In the following schemata, therefore, we show, as we have promised, to a great extent the authority of weighing elements, of defining temporal measures in wax, and thenceforward of prescribing in wax the power and virtue of certain grades. I'm going to move that cute little drawing there so I can talk about a few of the words. First of all, you have the plural of elementus here, but that can also mean an alphabet. It can also mean the classical elements, 5 or 4, but the authority of weighing elements. Okay, if this is basic principles, you can't really weigh a principle. You can't really weigh the abstract concept of a letter in the alphabet. I mean, now we might talk about it as a waveguide or something, but that seems like an impossible reach for that time. And what about the elements themselves? You might think you can weigh the elements, but think about it. Can you weigh fire? We can weigh air now, but what we mean by air is not the element air. You can do a liquid measure of water, but H2O is not what they meant by water. So if you bring in the ideas from the Sefer Yetzirah, which we have seen woven in all the way through, you don't have earth as an element until Malkuth. We realized in 21 that we're talking about Malkuth of Malkuth and Asaya. So the pure air, fire, water only exist above the world of Asaya, above the Sephira Malkuth. So if you're weighing something in Malkuth, you're weighing something that is earth, and it may have some of those other elements mixed in, but you don't know. Remember that from the Timaeus. There's the idea you can't step in the same river twice. You can't even tell what the elements are. The reason you're going through the process of spiritual alchemy by this way of thinking is to separate things out so you know what's what, and what is just garbage is the dross you're burning out. What else here would we say? The prescribing in wax. That can mean just wax, but it can also mean a wax writing tablet. And since he talked about making a seal of his monad glyph, you tend to make a seal in wax. Some of you who know his later work know his Sigillum D. Ameth, or his Seal of Truth of God. That was made in a wax tablet, for example. When we get to grades, he's previously talked about initiatory grades in Theorems 21 and 22. But if a reader hasn't realized that, and to be fair, most readers working on their own without help are not going to realize that until many times through. So the reader is more likely to read this as Latin steps and expect what comes next to be an understanding of the steps in weights and measures, just so you know that. If a reader has only partially understood the monad, but has understood the concepts of Platonic forms, which I think is much more likely, then the reader will at least realize the concept of temporal and spatial measures being similar in a golden age, and try to understand it that way. What I mean by that is an idea we haven't talked about since the first 10 theorems, I don't think. So it's the idea that, say, a circle has 360 degrees, and it flips into a sphere, the most perfect form in the Timaeus. But in a year, rather than 360 days, you have 365. It's a little off. That's typical of the fallen world, or the world of becoming. And actually, there are some calendars that, because of that, have what are called intercalary days that are sacred, where it's where basically the calendar resets, and the Egyptian calendar was one of them, for example. Okay, so, but spatial measurements, since I brought that up, those are not the same as weights. Weights make you think of being weighed down in Malkuth, or in the physical plane, or within corporality. And within the Kabbalistic understanding, they'd imply earth, the only element that you can easily weigh, because it exists in Malkuth, which is where these measurements are relevant anyway. And we've talked about how measurements really only relate to the world of Asaya when we got to the end of Theorem 22. All right, let's go and look at chart number 3. I'm sorry that this is kind of small on your screen. It's page 22 in our translation if you have it. If not, really it's not going to be very different in different translations. So let's read through the main 3 categories, and then we're going to read through the main 6 categories. He says, our numbers here have dignity. It is a sin against the wisdom of nature to violate their laws. For and by these laws nature wants to teach us, through its own most examined mysteries, by what certain immovable limits they are constrained. We talked about limits with the drafting instructions, right? It has a couple of different meanings. One is educational limits, perceptive limits. So these, and then he divides into 3: virility, weights, and time. So he's given you a ternary there, but honestly, and tell me if you know this somewhere else, I have never seen that kind of ternary anywhere else, but we can understand it. Virility, for example, in the sense of this top group, means life force. Actually, in the physical alchemy of the animal kingdom, that's what you're trying to create, the medicine to prolong life. But then, so let's take virility along the top there. Virility put in motion from the outside of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. So what would he mean by those 4 grades? Be careful here, because yeah, he set up 2 grades of the moon in 21, and then there's 4 subgrades. But that wouldn't be the 4 subgrades, and he has 2 major grades. So actually what I would say you're looking at, since it's put in motion from the outside, rather than what you are doing out of your desire to merge with the divine and burn out the dross, is these are the 4 worlds that he's talking about there. Now go to the one underneath that's internally acquired, that he relates to the denarian. 1, 10, 100 to infinity. Think back to his Pythagorean y that goes up to 10,000, but that's a myriad, which in effect is lots and lots up to infinity. So internally acquired is where it is something that's that middle part that you or humanity, it says, doing of their own volition, trying to perfect things. Okay, now we'll go to his weights right here. He divides that into analytic and synthetic. That's the kind of synthesis and analysis that we might use in writing theory, say. Analysis is, or for that matter, in alchemy. Analysis is breaking something down into components so you can better understand those components. Synthesis is taking those components and creating something that is greater than the sum of its parts. So the analysis, he has taken, notice you get 4 and 3. You're not getting 8. You're getting 4 and 3, because we're in the world of becoming. And with synthesis, you get that divided into 2 groups, where there is the second larger term of a ratio and the first larger term of a ratio. Those things we have translated this way actually are words in ancient Greek that are so specific there's not an English translation. We've just translated basically what they mean. And then he's going to correlate this to a group of numbers. So what does he mean here? Since these numbers are going to show up in the very next chart, and I'm giving you that next chart for homework, I'm going to defer answering that for now, but just take a look and notice that, I mean, 24 we've divided up into all kinds of ways, but 25, well, that's 7. Why does he have 13 there, other than the gematria of that would be 4? So back to that before too long. And at the bottom here, the magisterial, we get having to do with the stone. Oh, I skipped over something, sorry. These terms with time, the particular time terms, are well-known terms from alchemy, very well-known. But he's considering time itself as a type of alchemy. He's not the only person who does that. Actually, I mean, Ovid does that in Metamorphosis. Hesiod does that. That's where we get Golden Age, Silver Age, Age of Heroes, those kind of things. But that's what he's talking about. And ponder it for a moment and remember, oh yeah, when the world ends, he has his vision of revelation, which would, the golden age. Okay, so magisterial, having to do with the stone and that projection powder that he talked about before, and fermentative, both he equates to 252. Why? Well, you know that, right? If you've been studying along, that's his number of the philosopher's stone. That's 3 times 7 times 12. That's the multiplied powers of the Hebrew alphabet from the Sefer Yetzirah. You multiply the 3 mothers times the singles times the simples times the doubles, and you get 252. To me, that's just one of the most beautiful concepts in the whole monad. Here, I want to show this to you in the Frankfurt edition, so you can see what I mean by these Greek. These are just, you know, there's one word connected to the ratio there. And then down here, these terms are so well known that he abbreviates them. All right, so that's what he's doing there, and we're now to our final chart, his horizon of eternity. In the Frankfurt edition, there is a slight difference here, and I've tended to look at the differences in the Frankfurt edition as nudges if someone needs a little help to figure it out, like his flipped monad. So in the Frankfurt edition, this 2 square here is simply blank. It's kind of covered up but readable in the Antwerp edition. So if you think, why? Well, that's the ternary he's talking about. He only needs 3. That's the most obvious reason. Also, if he's relying on Zosimos, which I am certain he is, Zosimos has 4 steps to the philosopher's stone, but one of them seems kind of the same, that is cinnabar and gold. And in different works, not only in that vision that I talked about, but in other works, they get shifted around. Grimes talks about why that is in a certain sense, I mean broadly, because the idea is you're metaphorically becoming gold, you're becoming like Ra associated with gold, god of the sun, and Ra gets equated with God in Judeo-Christian God, other so-called pagan gods, and so on. But um, that is one reason. And by the way, I do want to point out up here that anthrax in Latin is not a poison. In fact, I'll flip to English quickly. It just means in Latin, natural cinnabar, okay? So these are easily relatable to alchemical concepts. So D is equating these to alchemical processes, but where it most equates is in the vision of Zosimus and a couple of other things of Zosimus in the Codex Marcianus that I haven't really talked about here. Let's look at this in English. So this is the horizon of eternity. And what do we notice with this? Well, we notice different monad glyphs too, right? We notice over here that this is terrestrial. So would we equate up to this point with Malkuth, perhaps? This is etheric. Maybe this is that path of the initiate where you're moving up energetically, but your feet are still in Malkuth and time is still going. What's going on over here? The ancient enigma of tenfold proportions explained. Well, if it's tenfold, why does he have 8? Oh, think of this. When you were drafting the monad or reading about drafting the monad in the first part of this theorem, remember where it seems he's being oddly vague and saying, oh, you can make this a 4th or a 5th. And then later he says, oh, you can make it an 8th or a 10th. It's because he's equating 8 and 10. So understanding that is what's going on here. Now, if you have understood even part of what has gone on in the monad, which you have, then you can impute even greater meaning to this chart. So as a way of kind of testing yourself in a friendly way, see what sense you can make of it. I want to go on to Theorem 24, but that's the very last theorem. And then I will come back and give you greater explanation of this chart. But I think that if you've been following along, you can do it without any problem. You know by now why he flips the monad and when. You know that This is his monad glyph, but also one of his symbols for Mercury. Another of his symbols for Mercury doesn't have that dot there. And here is yet another of his symbols for Mercury. He's talked about 4 revolutions, and you know what those 4 revolutions would also mean Kabbalistically. And then I said in the last one that we were going to look at why 12, 13, 24, 25. But see if you can figure that out. You have all the tools at your disposal. And I am not convinced, by the way, that I know all the answers to this. In fact, I'm certain I don't. So maybe you'll come up with something different than what I'll talk about when I review this as a kind of homework assignment. We are now to the last couple of paragraphs in this theorem. So let's just read through them here together. He says, it is not proper to speak about how, out of these schemata, if introspectively considered, many things are elicited and uncovered. Here, however, we draw your attention to one singular thing, which together with this whole new art has been first promulgated by us, that the explanation has been here put down concerning why the quaternary or the denary impose certain limits upon enumeration, and that the reason as conveyed by the masters who preceded us was not, as we affirm, as exact and absolute as the one we will tell you now. Then he says, after this monad, itself untouched, is fully and physically restored, for then there is a most united monad, and what the Magi reveal as oneness, it is not in the power of nature nor any art to impel more than the same 4 super-celestial revolutions to make any progress or motion. From thence, that is begotten, which, because of its own eminence, we have wished to denote in this way, and because there are no created influential powers, not in the elemental world, nor the celestial, nor the super-celestial, by which that one then and there would not be most absolutely enriched and endowed. And he gives you a picture of his monad glyph. But what you might notice about it is it's like the fire at the bottom is separated out. It's like a little rocket taking off upward. So we might suspect right there that we are about to return to his vision of the afterlife as we had in Theorem 20. And indeed, that's what we're going to do. I would interpret this among the super celestial revolutions, and I'll talk about this more in my solution to the homework I'm giving you, okay? But the easiest way to understand this is hand in hand with the 4 worlds of Kabbalah, okay? That if you consider that a kind of revolution. Okay, there is also a real strangely vague pronoun reference here. And in Latin, this that could also be an it or a he. Um, he's like going out of his way there to not just repeat monad or to structure the sentence in a way so it's clear that it's monad, although that's what is most implied. From thence, that is begotten, which, so the monad is begotten, the 4 worlds are begotten. I mean, that's a very, very, and very typically D way of hiding something, right? There's something you're supposed to bring in that you already know. And the way I read it is 4 worlds, as I've said. There's an important page break that comes before the next graphic appears. It doesn't always come at the end of the paragraph. It can come in the middle of the paragraph. But if you have partly understood what is happening, it would be in the previous theorems, you're going to definitely see symbolically what is happening here, right? So we have his little spaceship monad taking off there and having been fired up the middle pillar. And then we get to a flip monad on the next page. And he says, once upon a time, in this place, the most pure medicine was philosophized together by the 4. The 4. Which 4? Oh, you know what it means when he flips the monad there. And the darker brown one was from the Frankfurt edition. This is from the original one. But the 4, well, if in this place means the monad glyph, what is the 4? He doesn't say 4 of what. So it is worth pondering to put together by the 4. It could be the 4 parts of his cross of the element. It could be any of his quaternaries. It could be the 4 archangels, since in effect, as Pico said, that just pondering the Sephiroth on the tree of life itself is a kind of angel magic. So we do know it can't be 4 elements because the monad is flipped, and with the flipped monad, we don't have Malkuth until, the 4th. And think about all of the things that that 4 meant in Theorem 20, which was his vision of revelation. It was explicitly alluding to revelation. And 4 meant multiple things, including the 4 parts of his rectilinear cross, which flipped into a cube. The stone the builder rejected merges with the stone in Tiferet, and that is a cube, and he has a solution to the Delian problem, and a cube rotating through a cube, which is an implicit hypercube. But you can find other 4s as well. I mean, it's all the things that are the quaternary minus the things that couldn't possibly be part of it, like, say, the element earth after the world ends. Okay, so you are almost to the end here. And the actual new material, like I've said, ended in Theorem 22 anyway. Next class, we are going to look at your homework. I'm going to correct, actually, not the next class. I'm just going to give you Theorem 24, then I'll come back with the homework after that. Okay, so let's see if you notice something about the layout of the Frankfurt edition. I wanted to talk about that before we get to the end of the class. As you know, I've tended to look at changes between the original and the Frankfurt edition as a kind of nudge. Well, there's one really fascinating nudge here. Take a look at this and see how many lines there are. Now, I didn't figure this out. This was David Ovison who figured this out, or noticed it. I don't know if I would have noticed it because I had read what he said about it first. But all right, there's 22 lines here if you count them. Unless a page has charts or an important break of some kind that you need, in the Frankfurt version, you get 22 lines over and over again. And then you get a title line, like a header, and a footer, so that gives you 24, which is pretty cool. All right, I think that's about all I'm going to do right now with Theorem 23. Just to repeat myself, I'm not going to give the answers to this homework before Theorem 24. Theorem 24 is real short. So I'm going to talk about Theorem 24 within the next day or so, and then I'll come back this weekend with the solution to that chart at the end of Theorem 23. Okay, but thank you again to all of you who have hung in there with me and now are almost done with being able to say, yes, I understand the hieroglyphic monad, and I will see you all next time. Bye for now.